Imagine losing the only home your family has known for over a century. Imagine watching strangers destroy everything your grandfather built with his own hands. This is what happened to Eli Zook, a quiet Amish farmer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The local Homeowners Association illegally sold his 2,100 acres to developers while he was away burying his wife. When he returned, bulldozers were already tearing down barns that had stood for generations. Most people would have given up or gotten angry, but Eli did something different. He went to the county courthouse and discovered something the HOA never expected. A century-old deed still gave him legal rights to all the land under their new luxury homes. So he did what any reasonable man would do. He legally transferred ownership of every single house in the development to himself. But what would he do with an entire neighborhood? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been the Zook family farm. Its golden light now falling on manicured lawns and vinyl siding instead of cornfields and weathered barnwood. Eli Zook stood at the edge of what used to be his property line, his calloused hands wrapped around a simple gold wedding band, the only jewelry he'd ever worn. For 40 years, that ring had symbolized his marriage to Sarah. And for 40 years before that, this land had been his world. The original land deed, yellowed with age and carefully preserved in Sarah's cedar hope chest, told the story of his great-grandfather's arrival in 1847. Heinrich Zook had purchased these 2,100 acres from a Quaker family moving west, paying gold coins he'd saved from his blacksmith work in Germany. The deed, written in formal script with elaborate flourishes, established not just ownership, but a covenant, a promise that this land would sustain the Zook family for generations to come. Eli remembered his grandfather reading from that deed on quiet Sunday evenings, tracing the property boundaries with a weathered finger. "See here, Eli," the old man would say in Pennsylvania Dutch. "This line runs from the old oak by the creek, north to the limestone ridge, then east along Miller's Run. Every stone marker, every fence post, every natural boundary had been etched into Eli's memory through childhood walks and morning chores. But now, where Miller's Run had once meandered through pasture land, a concrete-lined storm drain carried suburban runoff beneath pristine sidewalks. Where the old oak had sheltered generations of cattle, a playground sat empty in the early morning light. The limestone ridge that had anchored the northern boundary now supported a row of identical colonial houses, each worth more than most people earned in 5 years. Sarah had seen it coming long before the bulldozers arrived. During the last months of her illness, when the cancer treatments left her too weak to tend her beloved garden, she would sit by the kitchen window and watch the development creeping closer. "They're circling us, Eli," she'd whisper, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of construction equipment, like wolves around a wounded deer. The Meadowbrook Estates development had risen with surprising speed. What began as surveyor stakes and cleared trees transformed into a maze of curving streets with names like Heritage Lane and Pastoral Drive, ironic monikers, for roads that had obliterated the very heritage and pastoral landscape they claimed to honor. The houses themselves were impressive by any standard. 3- and 4-bedroom colonials with attached garages, professional landscaping, and swimming pools that sparkled like jewels in backyards where corn had once grown tall. The Meadowbrook Homeowners Association ruled this new kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet glove of community standards. President Janet Morrison, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s who'd moved from Philadelphia to escape the city's problems, had made it her mission to maintain property values through strict enforcement of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Her Tuesday morning inspections were legendary among residents. She could spot an unauthorized mailbox color from 3 blocks away, and had once fined a family for leaving their garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours past. Pickup time. Treasurer Rick Coleman, a retired insurance executive with a perpetual tan and golf shirt uniform, handled the association's finances with the same ruthless efficiency he'd once applied to denying claims. He took particular pride in the association's healthy reserve fund, built through aggressive assessment collections and creative fee structures that few homeowners fully understood. Secretary Linda Hayes, a former school administrator, documented every violation and maintained meticulous records that could support legal action when residents challenged the board's decisions. These three had orchestrated the acquisition of Eli's land through a series of legal maneuvers that exploited his absence during Sarah's final weeks. While he sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand through endless rounds of chemotherapy, they'd filed papers claiming the property had been abandoned. While he arranged her funeral and mourned beside her grave, they'd pushed through a fast-tracked sale to Coleman Development Corporation, a company that, coincidentally, shared Rick Coleman's surname. The new residents of Meadowbrook Estates lived lives that seemed almost alien to Eli's Amish sensibilities. They drove matching SUVs that never carried anything heavier than groceries, maintained lawns that served no purpose beyond appearance, and spent their evenings behind glowing screens instead of on front porches. Most worked in distant offices, commuting daily to jobs Eli couldn't quite comprehend, returning home exhausted to houses filled with conveniences that somehow left them feeling empty. Yet among these suburban pioneers, there were kind souls who reminded Eli that goodness existed everywhere. Betty Sheffer, an 82-year-old widow who lived in the colonial closest to his remaining 5 acres, had been the only neighbor to attend Sarah's funeral. She brought a casserole that first evening and stayed to help him sort through Sarah's belongings, a kindness that transcended the cultural divide between their worlds. Betty had moved to Meadowbrook after her husband's death, selling the family home in Lancaster City to live closer to her daughter. But her daughter's job had since transferred to Colorado, leaving Betty alone in a house too large for her needs, surrounded by neighbors too busy to notice her loneliness. She found solace in her garden, coaxing tomatoes and beans from soil that had been stripped and replanted with suburban grass. "That's good earth you're working," Eli had told her one morning, watching her tend a small vegetable plot behind her house. "Not as good as it was when your corn grew here," she'd replied, brushing soil from her hands. "I can still see the rows sometimes when the morning mist rises, like ghost lines running through all these lawns." The contrast between their worlds had been stark even before the land dispute. Eli rose with the sun, following rhythms established by generations of farmers who understood that land was not something you owned, but something you stewarded. His days began with morning chores, feeding the chickens that still pecked around his small remaining property, checking on the vegetable garden Sarah had planted in her final spring, maintaining the simple tools that had served his family for decades. His house, a modest 2-story structure built by his grandfather in 1923, stood in deliberate contrast to the suburban mansions surrounding it. No central air conditioning cooled its rooms. Windows and cross breezes had been sufficient for 4 generations of Zooks. No dishwasher sat in the kitchen washing dishes by hand provided time for reflection and prayer. No television dominated the living room. Conversation and reading filled the evening hours that others surrendered to electronic entertainment. The silence left by Sarah's passing had been profound. For 4 decades, she'd been his companion in all things, working beside him in the fields during harvest season, canning vegetables from their garden each fall, sitting with him on the front porch as evening settled over the land. Her laughter had filled rooms that now seemed to echo with emptiness. Her wisdom had guided decisions that he now faced alone. She'd been the bridge between their private world and the expanding suburban community. When new neighbors had questions about local history or needed help with their struggling gardens. Sarah had been the gentle ambassador who shared knowledge without judgment. She taught Janet Morrison how to preserve tomatoes, helped Rick Coleman's wife identify the bird species frequenting their new bird feeder, and showed Linda Hayes how to braid corn husks into decorations. But Sarah had also been the family's historian, keeping careful records of everything that mattered. Her garden journal, a leather-bound book she'd maintained for 38 years, contained detailed notes about weather patterns, soil conditions, and the seasonal rhythms that governed life on the land. She'd recorded not just what was planted and when, but how the land responded to care, how it changed with the years, and how it connected them to the generations who'd worked it before Dot in the weeks after her death. Eli had found himself reading her entries like love letters from another time. April 15th, 1985. First asparagus shoots pushing through near the old well. Eli repaired the fence line to the same spot his father mended every spring. September 22nd, 1997. Corn harvest better than expected. Found arrowhead near the Creek Cherokee, Eli thinks. Land remembers everyone who's loved it. Now, standing in the shadow of suburban prosperity built on the bones of his family's heritage, Eli felt the weight of that history pressing against his chest. The wedding ring on his finger caught the morning light, reminding him of vows made not just to Sarah, but to the land itself. He'd promised to protect what had been entrusted to him, to preserve what others had sacrificed to build. The developers had taken his fields, his barns, his pastures, everything except the 5 acres around his house and the memories that no deed could transfer. But they'd also awakened something in him that had been dormant during Sarah's illness and his early grief. They'd reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight required abandoning the Amish principle of turning the other cheek. The letter had been waiting on his kitchen table when he returned from Lancaster General Hospital, where Sarah had breathed her last breath on a Tuesday morning in March. Folded inside her worn leather Bible, the envelope bore his name in her. Careful script, one final message from the woman who'd shared his life for 4 decades. "My dearest Eli," it began, "if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead to prepare a place for us, just as our Lord promised. But I fear I'm leaving you to face a battle I won't be here to help you fight. The Morrisons and their friends have been asking too many questions about our land, making too many visits to the courthouse. They think we're simple folk who won't understand their legal maneuvering. But I've seen the hunger in their eyes when they look at our fields. Promise me you won't let them steal what your great-grandfather built. Promise me you'll find a strength to protect our legacy, even if it means doing things our people have never done before. The land remembers everyone who's loved it. Make sure it remembers you were the one who fought for it. All my love, Sarah." He'd folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her Bible, then sat in the kitchen chair where she'd written it, feeling the weight of her final request settling over his shoulders like a yoke. 3 days later, he discovered exactly what she'd been afraid of. The sound reached him first, the deep rumble of diesel engines and the mechanical screech of metal against earth. Eli had been returning from Sarah's burial, still wearing his plain black suit, when he crested the hill that overlooked his fields and saw the impossible sight before him. Bulldozers, 3 of them, yellow as summer corn, pushing through the remains of his grandfather's barn. The structure that had sheltered livestock through 90 winters was being reduced to splinters and dust, its hand-hewn beams snapping like kindling under the assault of progress. Beyond the barn, surveyors in orange vests were marking property lines with bright flags, mapping the destruction to come. Eli's horse, startled by the noise, shied sideways and whinnied nervously. For a moment, man and animal stood frozen in mutual disbelief, watching strangers dismantle a life's work without ceremony or apology. Then, Eli climbed down from his buggy and walked toward the nearest machine, his black Sunday shoes sinking in the mud churned by heavy treads. The foreman was a thick-set man with graying hair and arms, marked by decades of outdoor work. Jake Sullivan had been clearing land for developers since the 1980s, and he'd learned to recognize the look on property owners' faces when they realized their world was changing. This Amish fellow had that look now shock mixed with something Sullivan couldn't quite identify. "You need to move along, friend," Sullivan called over the engine noise, gesturing toward the road. "This is private property now. Active construction zone." "This is my property," Eli replied, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "That was my grandfather's barn you just destroyed." Sullivan cut the engine and climbed down from his dozer, pulling a folder of documents from the cab. "Sorry, but you're mistaken. We got all the proper paperwork right here. This land was sold to Meadowbrook Development Corporation 3 weeks ago. Legal purchase, all above board." He handed Eli a thick sheaf of papers covered with official seals and legal language. The words blurred together: abandonment proceedings, tax delinquency, eminent domain, but the meaning was clear enough. According to these documents, the Zook family farm no longer existed in the eyes of the law. "I was never told about any sale," Eli said, his hands trembling slightly as he held the papers. "No one asked my permission." "Don't need to," Sullivan replied, not unkindly. Property was declared abandoned after the owner failed to respond to multiple notices. Standard procedure when land sits vacant and taxes aren't paid. The taxes were paid. "I have the receipts in my house," Sullivan shrugged, already climbing back onto his machine. "Take it up with the county if you want, but we got our work orders. Sorry about your barn, but it was coming down one way or another." The engine roared back to life, effectively ending the conversation. Eli stood holding the legal papers as the bulldozer resumed its methodical destruction, each push of the blade erasing another piece of his family's history. The limestone foundation stones his great-grandfather had quarried by hand were being scattered like toys. The hayloft where he played as a child was becoming debris for a dumpster. That evening, Eli walked to the offices of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association, housed in a converted garage behind Janet Morrison's colonial home. The building had once been his own equipment barn, another structure sold along with the land, but now it sported vinyl siding and a sign reading Community Management Center. Janet Morrison answered his knock with the expression of someone interrupted during dinner. She was younger than Eli by a decade, with the kind of crisp efficiency that came from years of managing other people's problems. Her blonde hair was styled in a practical bob, and she wore the sort of casual business attire that suggested she'd changed out of a suit, but hadn't quite relaxed for the evening. "Mr. Zook, isn't it? I'm sorry for your loss. We all heard about your wife. But if you're here about the construction noise, I can assure you it's within permitted hours." "I'm here about my land," Eli said simply. "The land your association sold without my permission." Janet's expression hardened slightly. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. The Meadowbrook Association purchased that property through completely legal channels. The previous owner had abandoned, hadn't been seen for months. We followed all proper procedures for abandoned property acquisition. I wasn't abandoning anything. I was caring for my dying wife. I'm sure that's what you believed you were doing, but legally speaking, absence is absence. When property sits unattended and tax notices go unanswered, the county has procedures to prevent blight and ensure continued tax revenue." Rick Coleman appeared behind her, still wearing the golf attire that seemed to be his uniform regardless of season. His tan face bore the confident expression of a man accustomed to winning arguments through superior knowledge of fine print. "Mr. Zook, let me be direct with you," Coleman said, stepping onto the porch. "We understand this is emotional for you, but business is business. Your property was acquired through entirely legal means, following procedures established by the county commissioners. We have all the proper documentation, including notices that were sent to your address and published in the legal section of the Intelligencer Journal. I never received any notices. That's unfortunate, but it doesn't invalidate the process. Legal notice doesn't require actual receipt. It just requires proper attempt at notification. Publication in the newspaper satisfies that requirement. Linda. Hayes joined them in the doorway, clutching a folder thick with documents. As the association's secretary, she'd overseen the paperwork that transformed Eli's heritage into suburban real estate. Her background as a school administrator had prepared her well for bureaucratic warfare. "Mr. Zook," she said in the patient, tone she'd once used with difficult parents, "I understand your confusion, but everything was done by the book. We have copies of all the legal notices, the abandonment proceeding records, and the tax assessments that triggered the process. Would you like to review them?" The 3 board members stood in the doorway like judges delivering a verdict. Behind them, Eli could see the comfortable interior of his former barn, now converted into an office with carpeting and fluorescent lights. Family photos and golf trophies lined the shelves where his grandfather's tools had once hung. "What gives you the right to take a man's land while he's burying his wife?" Eli asked, his voice carrying a note that made all 3 board members step back slightly. "The law gives us that right," Janet replied coldly. "We didn't create the system, Mr. Zook. We just used it to prevent urban blight and protect property values for the residents who depend on us. Your land was sitting empty, becoming an eyesore. Someone had to take responsibility, so you decided to steal it. We decided to acquire it legally and develop it responsibly. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to understand the nuances of municipal law." The conversation might have continued, but Eli recognized the futility of arguing with people who'd already decided he was nothing more than an obstacle to progress. He turned away from their self-righteous expressions and walked back to his buggy, their voices following him into the darkness. "If you have any further questions, Mr. Zook, I suggest you consult an attorney. But I should warn you that challenging this acquisition would be expensive and time-consuming, with very little chance of success." As he drove home through streets that had once been his fields, Eli felt something shifting inside him, a steel resolve that Sarah's letter had planted and the HOS arrogance had watered. At her grave the next morning, he made a promise that would have shocked his Amish neighbors and terrified the Meadowbrook board. "I won't let them win, Sarah. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I'll find a way to make this right." David Walsh's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on North Queen Street in Lancaster, sandwiched between a used bookstore and a restaurant that had served the same Pennsylvania Dutch menu for 30 years. The narrow staircase creaked under Eli's boots as he climbed to the simple wooden door marked Walsh and Associates, Estate Planning and Real Property. The decision to seek legal counsel had not come easily. The Amish tradition of settling disputes through community mediation rather than courtroom battles ran deep in Eli's bones. Bishop Samuel Miller had counseled patience and forgiveness during their long conversation the previous Sunday evening, reminding Eli that the Lord called his people to turn the other cheek rather than fight fire with fire. "The English have their ways and we have ours," Bishop Miller had said, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. "When they take our land, we find other land. When they wrong us, we forgive them. This is the path of peace, Eli." But Sarah's letter had planted a seed of righteous anger that grew stronger each time Eli watched construction crews destroying another piece of his family's legacy. The surveyor's stakes marching across his fields looked like grave markers for everything his great-grandfather had built. The distant sound of diesel engines felt like a mechanical heartbeat counting down the moments until his voice. Heritage vanished completely. David Walsh proved to be a surprise. Eli had expected a sharp-dressed city lawyer with expensive suits and calculating eyes. Instead, He found a man perhaps 10 years his senior, with the weathered hands of someone who understood physical work and the patient manner of someone who'd learned to listen before speaking. Walsh's office reflected the same practical sensibility plane. Wooden furniture, law books with worn spines, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. "Coffee?" Walsh asked, gesturing to a pot that looked like it had been brewing since morning. "Thank you, no," Eli replied, settling into a chair that had probably been old when Walsh first hung his shingle. "My grandfather farmed near Strasburg," Walsh said, pulling a legal pad from his desk drawer. "Sold out to developers in the 1970s when he got too old to work the land. Regretted it until the day he died. Not the money, mind you, but watching what they did to the soil. Said they stripped away 100 years of careful cultivation like it was nothing more than dirt." The comment put Eli at ease in a way that no amount of legal credentials could have accomplished. Here was a man who understood that land meant more than property values and development potential. Here was someone who might actually listen to his story without immediately calculating billable hours. "Tell me what happened," Walsh said. His pen poised over the legal pad. Eli began with Sarah's illness and death, then moved through the discovery of the bulldozers and his confrontation with the HOA board. Walsh listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes, but mostly just absorbing the story with the focus of someone who'd heard similar tales before. "Do you have any of the original property documents?" Walsh asked when Eli finished. Sarah kept everything in her cedar chest. Deeds, surveys, tax records, going back to when my great-grandfather bought the land. "I'd like to see those, particularly any surveys or property descriptions. Sometimes there are discrepancies between historical records and current county files. Discrepancies that can be very useful in cases like this." The great-grandfather's survey map proved to be exactly what Walsh had hoped to find. The hand-drawn document, created by County Surveyor William Harrison in 1847, showed property boundaries that didn't match the current official records, where the modern deed described the eastern boundary as running along the current right-of-way of Miller's Run Road. The 1847 survey showed the boundary running along the natural course of Miller's Run, itself a waterway that had been diverted twice over the intervening decades to accommodate road construction. "This is interesting," Walsh murmured, spreading the old map alongside a current aerial photograph of the development. "Your great-grandfather's property line actually extended about 200 feet further east than what the county shows now. That puts part of the development, maybe 30 or 40 houses on land that was never properly transferred from your family." "What does that mean?" "It means the HOA may have sold property they never actually owned. It means their legal foundation might be shakier than they think." But Walsh's investigation soon revealed that shaking the HOA's legal foundation would require more than just historical discrepancies. The abandoned property proceedings had been filed with surgical precision, following every procedural requirement. Despite their questionable ethics, legal notices had indeed been published in the newspaper, though buried in the small print that no one except lawyers ever read. Tax assessments had been calculated correctly, even though they reflected a deliberately inflated valuation designed to trigger delinquency proceedings. They knew exactly what they were doing, Walsh explained during their second meeting. This wasn't some bureaucratic accident. It was a carefully orchestrated land grab executed while you were dealing with your wife's death. The realization that his neighbors had deliberately targeted him during his most vulnerable moments struck Eli like a physical blow. He'd assumed the HOA's actions reflected bureaucratic indifference rather than calculated malice. Learning that they'd planned their attack while he sat beside Sarah's hospital bed transformed his grief into something harder and more dangerous. "Can we fight it?" "We can try, but it won't be easy." They followed the letter of the law, even if they violated its spirit. Proving that they acted in bad faith will require showing that they knew you were caring for your wife and deliberately chose to move while you were distracted. How do we prove that? We start by examining every document in their files. We look for emails, meeting minutes, anything that shows they discussed your situation before filing the abandonment proceedings. We also need to research the ownership structure of the development company. If board members have financial interests in the buyer, that could constitute a conflict of interest. The investigation would take months, Walsh warned, and success was far from guaranteed. Even if they uncovered evidence of improper conduct, the HOA's lawyers would fight every challenge with the resources of the entire development behind them. Eli would be gambling his remaining savings against an opponent with effectively unlimited legal funds. But as they talked, Walsh began to see something in the quiet Amish farmer that reminded him of his own grandfather, a stubborn streak hidden beneath layers of humility and religious conviction. This was a man who'd spent his life working land that demanded both patience and persistence. He understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. There's something else we should consider, Walsh said, pulling out another folder. I've been researching property records for this entire area, trying to understand how the county's boundaries evolved over time. There are some interesting anomalies, places where historical surveys don't match current property descriptions. He spread several documents across his desk, creating a timeline of land transfers stretching back to the original colonial patents. The pattern that emerged told a story of gradual encroachment, administrative errors, and bureaucratic shortcuts that had slowly eroded property rights over several generations. Your family isn't the only one affected, Walsh continued. There are at least 3 other properties in this area where historical boundaries don't match current county records. If we can prove a pattern of negligent record-keeping or deliberate boundary manipulation, it strengthens our position considerably. The possibility that other families had suffered similar injustices added a new dimension to Eli's motivation. This wasn't just about his own land anymore. It was about protecting the rights of everyone who trusted the system to preserve what their ancestors had built. Bishop Miller's concerns about abandoning Amish principles for English law began to seem less relevant as the scope of the problem became clear. Sometimes, Eli thought, turning the other cheek meant allowing bullies to continue hurting other innocent people. Sometimes the most faithful response to injustice was not submission, but resistance. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when Walsh called with barely contained excitement in his voice. Eli, I need you to come to the office immediately. I found something that changes everything. The missing document had been misfiled in the county courthouse for nearly a century, tucked between unrelated property transfers in a folder marked Road Easements 1920 to 1925, the single-page agreement, signed by Eli's grandfather Abraham Zook in 1923, granted Lancaster County the right to build a public road across the northwest corner of the family property. But the carefully worded document did something else entirely. It explicitly reserved all subsurface rights and adjacent mineral rights to the Zook family in perpetuity. Your grandfather was no fool, Walsh explained, spreading the fragile paper across his desk like a treasure map. When the county wanted to build Miller's Run Road, he didn't just give them an easement. He negotiated a deal that protected your family's long-term interests while still being a good neighbor. The implications were staggering. The 1923 easement document established legal precedent for Zook family ownership of subsurface rights throughout the area that eventually became Meadowbrook Estates. More importantly, it demonstrated a pattern of careful legal thinking that contradicted the HOA's characterization of the Amish as simple folks who didn't understand property law. But here's the truly interesting part, Walsh continued, pulling out a stack of additional documents. When the county expanded Miller's Run Road in 1976, They needed additional property from your family. Your father, Isaac Zook, signed off on the expansion, but look at what he negotiated in return. The 1976 agreement was more sophisticated than anything Eli would have expected from his soft-spoken father. Isaac had granted the county additional road right-of-way, but in exchange, he'd secured agricultural protection status for the remaining family property. The designation meant that any future development would require specific approval from the County Agricultural Preservation Board, approval that the HOA had never sought. They can't develop agricultural preservation land without going through the proper channels, Walsh explained. It's a state program designed to protect working farms from exactly this kind of development pressure. Your father essentially created a legal firewall around your property 30 years before anyone thought it would be needed. The discovery transformed their legal position overnight. Instead of fighting an uphill battle against a completed development, they now had grounds to challenge the entire project's legal foundation. The HOA had built Meadowbrook Estates on land that couldn't legally be developed without agricultural preservation. Board approval they'd never requested because they'd never bothered to research the property's protected status. But Walsh's victory celebration was tempered by a sobering realization. Exposing the HOA's legal vulnerabilities would trigger a scorched earth response from their legal team. Patricia Vance, the association's attorney, had built her reputation on winning property disputes through aggressive litigation tactics that bankrupted opponents before cases ever reached trial. She's going to come after us with everything she has, Walsh warned. They've invested millions in this development, and admitting they built it on illegally acquired land would expose them to lawsuits from every homeowner who bought property there. They'll fight this like their lives depend on it. The prediction proved accurate within 48 hours. Eli was feeding his chickens on Thursday morning when Rick Coleman's silver Mercedes pulled into his driveway, followed by a Lancaster County code enforcement vehicle. Coleman emerged wearing his standard golf attire, but his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something harder and more predatory. "Mr. Zook," Coleman called, approaching the chicken coop with obvious distaste for the rural setting. "I hope you don't mind the unscheduled visit, but we have some concerns about code violations on your property." The code enforcement officer, a young man who looked uncomfortable with his assignment, began photographing everything in sight: the chicken coop, the vegetable garden, the simple wooden fence that separated Eli's remaining acres from the development. His camera clicked constantly as Coleman provided a running commentary on alleged violations. Unpermitted agricultural structures within a residential zone, Coleman dictated while the officer photographed a chicken coop that had stood for decades. Inadequate setback from property lines. Possible health hazards from livestock in a suburban environment. "Those chickens have been here longer than your development," Eli said quietly. "That's unfortunate, but times change," Coleman replied. "When the county rezoned this area for residential use, agricultural operations became non-conforming uses. They can continue only as long as they comply with current health and safety standards, standards that your setup clearly violates." The harassment campaign escalated daily. Property inspectors arrived with increasingly creative violations. The solar panels on Eli's barn were allegedly installed without proper permits. His vegetable garden created visual blight that negatively impacted neighboring property values. And his horse-drawn buggy constituted a traffic hazard when parked in his own driveway. Each violation carried fines that individually seemed modest but collectively threatened to drain Eli's limited financial resources. The legal strategy was transparent, force him to choose between fighting the land case and defending against a barrage of administrative penalties designed to exhaust his ability to pay for both battles. But the campaign had an unexpected consequence. It awakened sympathy among Meadowbrook residents who'd been watching the conflict from their windows. Betty Sheffer was the first to voice what others were thinking during a chance encounter at the rural hardware store. "What they're doing to you isn't right," she told Eli, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades of life experience. "I've been researching property deeds for my own house, trying to understand what we actually bought when we moved here. The more I learn, the more questions I have about how this whole development was put together." Her support provided both emotional comfort and practical assistance. Betty had been a legal secretary for 40 years before retirement, and her familiarity with property law proved invaluable as Walsh's investigation expanded. She volunteered to help research historical records, bringing the kind of methodical attention to detail that comes from years of professional document review. "I found something interesting," she told him during a meeting at Walsh's office. "The property deed for my house shows that I own the land beneath my foundation, but the HOA maintains ownership of all subsurface rights for the common areas. That's unusual. Most developments transfer all rights to individual homeowners." The pattern Betty discovered suggested that the HOA had structured the development to retain maximum control over the property, even after selling individual homes. They'd essentially created a feudal system where homeowners paid for houses, but the HOA maintained ownership of the underlying land rights that might not have been theirs to sell in the first place. As spring turned to summer, Eli's quiet determination began attracting unexpected allies throughout the community. The David versus Goliath narrative resonated with residents who'd grown frustrated with the HOA's increasingly arbitrary enforcement of community standards. Stories spread about families fined for planting the wrong flowers, installing mailboxes in unauthorized colors, or failing to maintain grass at the prescribed height. The conflict was becoming about more than just Eli's land. It was becoming a referendum on the kind of community Meadowbrook wanted to be. The Manila folder, containing the county commissioner meeting minutes from October 15, 1976, had been buried so deep in the courthouse basement that Martha Hendricks needed a flashlight to read the faded typescript. As the county's senior records clerk, she'd spent 37 years filing documents that most people would never see again. But Walsh's research request had piqued her curiosity about a case that seemed to involve deliberate record manipulation. "Your Mr. Zook's father was quite the negotiator," Martha told Walsh when she called with her discovery. These minutes show that Isaac Zook didn't just object to the rezoning. He extracted specific concessions that protected his family's agricultural rights in perpetuity. The October 1976 meeting had been contentious, with developers pushing for residential zoning that would open rural Lancaster County to suburban expansion. Isaac Zook had been the only farmer to appear before the commissioners with legal representation, presenting a carefully crafted compromise that allowed limited development while preserving agricultural uses on the core family property. "The minutes show that your father specifically reserved the right to continue farming operations regardless of future zoning changes," Walsh explained to Eli during their next meeting. He also negotiated language that required any future development to maintain existing agricultural access roads and water rights. The commissioners agreed to these terms as part of the rezoning approval. More importantly, the 1976 agreement established that any subsequent development on the protected agricultural land would require a supermajority vote of the County Planning Commission, a requirement that could only be waived if the original landowner provided written consent. Isaac Zook had essentially created a legal veto over any development that threatened his family's farming operation. "They never got your consent to build Meadowbrook Estates," Walsh continued. "According to these minutes, they couldn't legally develop that land without your explicit approval, regardless of how they acquired it." The discovery sent shockwaves through the HOA's legal team. Patricia Vance's confident dismissal of Eli's claims suddenly seemed premature. When faced with documented evidence that the entire development had been built in violation of binding county agreements, Her response was swift and predictable, an escalation of harassment designed to intimidate Eli into abandoning his increasingly strong legal position. The new attacks were more sophisticated than simple code violations. Anonymous complaints to state health inspectors resulted in surprise visits to examine Eli's well water and septic system. Environmental Protection Agency officials arrived to investigate alleged groundwater contamination from his small livestock operation. Even the IRS received tips about potential tax violations related to his limited cash income from selling vegetables at farmers markets. Each investigation required Eli's time and attention, pulling him away from the land case and forcing him to defend against accusations that ranged from petty to absurd. The message was clear: drop the lawsuit or face years of bureaucratic warfare designed to exhaust his resources and patience. But the harassment campaign began to backfire as more Meadowbrook residents learned about the HOA's tactics. Tom Bradley, a retired engineer who'd moved to the development seeking peace after a stressful corporate career, found himself increasingly disturbed by his neighbor's treatment of the elderly Amish farmer. "I didn't buy a house here to watch bullies pick on decent people," Bradley told his wife during one of their evening walks past Eli's property. "That man lost his wife and his land, and instead of showing compassion, we're letting our HOA torture him with bureaucratic nonsense." Bradley's engineering background had taught him to analyze problems systematically, and his review of publicly available development documents raised questions that the HOA board seemed reluctant to answer. Property boundary surveys didn't match the descriptions in individual deeds. Environmental impact assessments referenced water sources that no longer existed. Construction permits showed approval dates that preceded required soil studies by several months. "Something doesn't add up," Bradley confided to Betty Sheffer during a chance encounter at the community mailbox. "I've built projects all over the country, and I've never seen this many discrepancies in the foundation documents. Either somebody made a lot of mistakes or somebody was cutting corners." The growing skepticism among residents created new challenges for Janet Morrison's leadership. HOA meetings that had once been sparsely attended affairs focused on landscaping budgets and pool maintenance schedules now drew standing room-only crowds, demanding answers about the development's legal foundation. Morrison's attempts to deflect questions with references to confidential legal advice only fueled more speculation about what the board was hiding. "We followed all proper procedures," Morrison insisted during a particularly heated August meeting. "Mr. Zook's claims are based on outdated documents that have no bearing on current property law. Our attorneys have assured us that his case has no merit." But her confidence seemed forced, and observant residents noticed the strain in her voice when fielding questions about the development's origins. Rick Coleman's usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by defensive irritability whenever anyone mentioned property boundaries or historical surveys. Linda Hayes had begun avoiding community events entirely, claiming that her secretary duties required too much time for social activities. The transformation of community dynamics accelerated when local media began covering the story. The Lancaster New Era's initial article presented the conflict as a simple property dispute, but follow-up reporting revealed the deeper issues of agricultural preservation and community character that resonated with readers throughout rural Pennsylvania. Amish farmer fights corporate land grab became a David versus Goliath narrative that attracted attention far beyond Lancaster County. Regional television stations picked up the story, and soon Eli found himself fielding interview requests from journalists who saw his case as emblematic of broader conflicts between development pressure and agricultural preservation. The media attention brought unexpected benefits to Walsh's legal strategy. Property law professors at Penn State and Temple University offered pro bono research assistance, intrigued by the complex intersection of historical property rights and modern development law. Environmental groups provided expert witnesses willing to testify about the ecological value of preserving agricultural land against suburban sprawl. But the publicity also intensified pressure on all parties to resolve the dispute before it spiraled completely out of control. County commissioners who'd approved the original development permits now face questions about their oversight responsibilities. State officials began reviewing Lancaster County's compliance with agricultural preservation programs. Even federal agencies expressed interest in whether wetlands protection requirements had been properly followed during the development's construction. Bishop Samuel Miller visited Eli on a quiet September evening, walking slowly through what remained of the family garden while choosing his words carefully. The Amish leader had watched the conflict evolve from a simple property dispute into a community-wide confrontation that threatened to divide Meadowbrook's residents into warring factions. "You've started something that's bigger than your land now," the bishop observed, pausing beside Sarah's carefully tended tomato plants. "People are choosing sides, and that creates wounds that take generations to heal. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" The question haunted Eli through the changing seasons as autumn colors painted the hills around Meadowbrook Estates. What had begun as a quest for justice was becoming a battle for the soul of an entire community, with consequences that would reach far beyond his own 5 remaining acres. Sarah's garden journal had become David Walsh's secret weapon, though he suspected even Eli didn't fully appreciate its legal significance. The leather-bound book, worn smooth by 40 years of daily handling, contained meticulous records that would have impressed the most demanding property surveyor. Every entry was dated, every observation tied to specific locations, every change in the land carefully documented with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. April 3, 1987. Planted early peas along the east fence line. 50 yards north of the old limestone marker, one entry read. Soil still poor where they stripped topsoil for the road widening. Added composted manure from the Holstein herd. September 15, 1994. Discovered foundation. Stones near the creek bend, probably from the original settler cabin. Eli thinks there. From Heinrich's first winter shelter, before he built the main house. Marked location with iron stakes for future reference. Page after page revealed a woman who treated the land like a living document, recording its moods and changes with the careful attention of a devoted scholar. Weather patterns, soil conditions, seasonal variations, everything that mattered to successful farming had been preserved in Sarah's careful handwriting. But more importantly for Walsh's purposes, the journal established continuous occupation. An improvement of the property that directly contradicted the HOA's claims of abandonment. "This journal is worth more than a surveyor's report," Walsh told Eli as they reviewed entries spanning 4 decades. Sarah documented active land management and improvement right up until her final illness. No abandoned property has this kind of detailed stewardship record. The journal also revealed something else. Sarah had been tracking the development pressure years before the HOA made its move. Entries from the early 2000s mentioned increasing visits from real estate agents, county assessors, and mysterious individuals who claimed to be conducting routine surveys but showed unusual interest in property, boundaries, and access roads. May 12, 2003. Another surveyor today, 3rd this month. Says he's updating county records, but his questions focused on our easement agreements and mineral rights. Eli thinks I'm being paranoid, but something feels wrong about all this attention. August 7, 2007. The Morrison woman stopped by again, offering to buy our excess acreage for her horse hobby. Her price was insultingly low, and she seemed more interested in our property lines than in keeping horses. I told her we weren't selling any land, excess or otherwise. The journal entries painted a picture of systematic intelligence gathering. That preceded the HOA's legal assault by several years. Sarah had recognized the threat, while Eli focused on daily farming operations, and her documentation provided evidence of the HOA's long-term strategy to acquire the Zook property through whatever means necessary. But preparing for a legal battle required more than just historical evidence. Walsh needed Eli to understand the emotional gauntlet that lay ahead. Depositions, where hostile attorneys would try to break his composure, courtroom procedures that would test his patience with English legal systems, and media scrutiny that would intrude on his traditionally private life. "They're going to come after you, character," Walsh warned during one of their preparation sessions. "They'll portray you as a backward farmer who doesn't understand modern property law. They'll question your competence to manage business affairs. They'll suggest that you're motivated by greed rather than justice." The prediction proved accurate when Patricia Vance began her discovery process. Her depositions were masterpieces of legal intimidation, designed to overwhelm Eli with technical language and rapid-fire questions that made simple answers seem evasive or ignorant. She questioned his education, his understanding of contracts, his ability to interpret legal documents, everything except the substance of his claims. "Mr. Zook, how many years of formal education did you complete?" Vance asked during one particularly aggressive session. 8 years, Eli replied calmly. "And you claim to understand the complex legal principles governing property abandonment proceedings?" "I understand that no one has the right to steal another man's land while he's burying his wife." The response seemed to catch Vance off guard, but she quickly recovered with another line of attack. "Do you have any training in survey methodology? Can you interpret metes and bounds descriptions? Are you qualified to assess the validity of property deeds?" "I'm qualified to know when I've been cheated." Walsh watched the exchanges with growing respect for his client's quiet dignity under pressure. Eli refused to be rattled by legal jargon or intimidated by aggressive questioning. His responses carried the moral authority of someone who'd been genuinely wronged and wasn't ashamed to seek justice through whatever means were necessary. The deposition strategy backfired when local media obtained transcripts that showed Vance's attempts to portray Eli as incompetent and greedy. Her condescending questions about his education and cultural background struck many readers as ethnic prejudice disguised as legal advocacy. Editorial writers began questioning whether the HOA's legal team was more interested in winning at any cost than in finding fair solutions to legitimate grievances. Meanwhile, Betty Sheffer's health was declining, but her determination to support Eli's case seemed to energize her through the worst symptoms. Her daily walks had become property boundary surveys as she compared her deed description with actual fence lines and landmarks. Her evening phone calls to other residents spread information about discrepancies between what they thought they bought and what they actually owned. "I've lived through the Depression, 2 wars, and 50 years of marriage," she told Walsh during one of his visits to her home. "I know the difference between right and wrong, and what's happening to Eli is wrong. If it takes my last breath to help him get justice, then that's how I'll spend it." Her cottage had become an informal headquarters for residents questioning the HOA's version of events. Tom Bradley brought engineering expertise, analyzing construction documents and environmental reports. Other neighbors contributed property deeds, tax records, and correspondence with county officials. What emerged was a pattern of corners cut, procedures abbreviated, and oversight responsibilities ignored during the development's approval process. The grassroots investigation revealed problems that extended far beyond Eli's property dispute. Stormwater management systems that hadn't been properly connected to county infrastructure. Wetlands permits that referenced ecological features destroyed during construction. Building permits approved without required soil stability studies. The development that looked so perfect from street level was built on a foundation of bureaucratic shortcuts and regulatory negligence. Bishop, Samuel Miller's concerns about community division proved prescient as Meadowbrook residents chose sides in what was becoming a civil war, fought with property deeds and legal briefs. Loyalists accused Eli supporters of undermining property values through their vocal criticism of the development's legal foundation. Eli's allies accused the HOA board of lying to residents about the development's true origins and exposing everyone to potential legal liability. The conflict reached a tipping point when anonymous flyers appeared throughout the development, questioning the HOA board's financial management and suggesting that legal costs for fighting Eli's lawsuit were being paid with Residents Association fees. Janet Morrison's attempts to suppress discussion at community meetings only fueled more speculation about what the board was hiding from homeowners. The manila envelope arrived at Walsh's office on a gray November morning, delivered by a courier who refused to identify his client and paid cash for same-day service. Inside, Walsh found a photocopy of a document that made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. The master title insurance policy for Meadowbrook Estates, stamped with a coverage limit of $52 million. Title insurance was supposed to be routine protection against exactly the kind of problems Walsh was alleging hidden: liens, boundary disputes, prior claims that could challenge a property owner's rights. But as Walsh studied the policy details, he realized that Commonwealth Title Insurance Company had made a catastrophic error when they'd insured the Meadowbrook development without properly researching the property's complex ownership history. The policy explicitly guaranteed that Meadowbrook Development Corporation held clear title to all 2,100 acres when construction began. If Eli's claims succeeded, if the courts determined that the HOA had never illegally acquired the property, then Commonwealth Title would be liable for damages to every homeowner in the development. Damages that could easily exceed the policy's $52 million limit. This changes everything, Walsh told Eli during an emergency meeting that afternoon. We're not just fighting the HOA anymore. We're fighting an insurance company that stands to lose more money than most people see in a lifetime. But the insurance company's massive liability also created an unexpected opportunity. Commonwealth Title had deep pockets and sophisticated legal resources. But they also had actuarial tables that calculated the cost of fighting versus the cost of settling. If Walsh could demonstrate that Eli's case had merit, the insurance company might find it cheaper to support his claims rather than defend against them. The anonymous tip about the insurance policy had come from someone with intimate knowledge of the development's financial structure, someone who wanted Eli to understand the true scope of what he was challenging. Walsh suspected the source was a disgruntled employee of either the HOA or the development company, but identifying the whistleblower was less important than understanding what their revelation meant for the case. Within days of receiving the the revelation meant for the case. Within days of receiving the the case insurance documents, Walsh noticed subtle changes in how the opposition was handling the case. Patricia Vance's aggressive discovery tactics gave way to settlement discussions. Rick Coleman's public statements about Eli's frivolous lawsuit disappeared from local media coverage. Janet Morrison began avoiding questions about the HOA's legal strategy, claiming that confidentiality agreements prevented her from discussing ongoing litigation. The transformation became complete when Commonwealth Title's legal team contacted Walsh directly, requesting a meeting to discuss potential areas of mutual interest. The insurance company's attorney, Robert Chun, was everything Patricia Vance wasn't: respectful, professional, and genuinely interested in finding facts rather than winning arguments. "We've reviewed your client's claims," Chum told Walsh during their first meeting. "Our preliminary analysis suggests that there may have been irregularities in the original property transfer that could affect our coverage obligations." The careful language couldn't disguise the insurance company's growing panic. Their own investigation had uncovered the same historical documents that supported Eli's case, plus additional evidence from their files showing that they've been pressured to issue the policy without conducting their usual due diligence review. The development company provided representations about clear title that appeared to have been optimistic. Chung continued, "We're concerned that we may have been induced to provide coverage based on incomplete information. What emerged from subsequent meetings was a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond the HOA's treatment of Eli. Meadowbrook Development Corporation had buried evidence of property disputes, misrepresented environmental clearances, and provided falsified surveys to expedite the insurance approval process. The company's principals had collected millions in profits while leaving the insurance company exposed to catastrophic liability. The revelation that Commonwealth Title had been victimized by the same fraud that targeted Eli created the possibility of an unprecedented alliance. The insurance company's resources and legal expertise, combined with Walsh's knowledge of the property's history, could expose the full scope of the development's corrupt foundations. But the alliance also placed Eli in an uncomfortable position. Commonwealth Title wasn't interested in justice or agricultural preservation. They wanted to minimize their financial exposure through whatever means proved most cost-effective. If supporting Eli's claims achieved that goal, they'd become enthusiastic allies. If crushing his case proved cheaper, they'd destroy him without hesitation. "They're not our friends," Walsh warned. "They're calculating machines that measure everything in dollars and cents. Right now, our interests align with theirs, but that could change at any moment." The insurance company's entry into the case sent shockwaves through Meadowbrook Estates. That registered on every resident's personal seismograph. Homeowners who dismissed Eli's lawsuit as the desperate gesture of a bidder old man suddenly faced the possibility that their property titles were legally worthless. If the courts ruled that the HOA had never properly acquired the land, every house in the development could be subject to eviction. Tom Bradley organized emergency meetings where residents tried to understand what Commonwealth Title's involvement meant for their investment security. Property values that had seemed stable suddenly looked precarious when measured against potential legal judgments. Families who'd stretched their finances to afford Meadowbrook homes now worried about losing everything to a property dispute they'd never heard of until construction was complete. "We bought these houses in good faith," Bradley argued during one heated community meeting. "If there were problems with the land titles, that's not our fault. The HOA's board told us everything was legal and properly documented." But Janet Morrison's responses to such concerns had become increasingly evasive. She referenced ongoing litigation as justification for refusing to discuss specifics. But her obvious discomfort suggested that she understood more about the development's legal vulnerabilities than she'd previously admitted. Rick Coleman had stopped attending community meetings entirely, claiming that his business obligations required extensive travel that coincidentally kept him away from Meadowbrook. During times of peak resident anxiety, the psychological pressure on HOA leadership intensified when local newspapers began investigating the development's approval process. Freedom of Information Act requests revealed correspondence between county officials and development company representatives that suggested unusual, expedited treatment for Meadowbrook's permits. Environmental clearances that normally required months of review had been approved in weeks. Zoning variances that typically faced community opposition had sailed through the approval process without public hearings. Patricia Vance's legal strategy shifted from attacking Eli's claims to damage control for her client's exposure to criminal liability. If prosecutors concluded that the land acquisition involved fraud, HOA board members could face charges that ranged from conspiracy to elder abuse. The stakes had escalated far beyond property disputes into territory where personal freedom hung in the balance. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Commonwealth Title's investigation had uncovered evidence that the development company's deception extended beyond property records into the realm of environmental crime. Wetlands that should have been protected under federal law had been deliberately destroyed and the evidence concealed through falsified ecological surveys. Storm water systems designed to protect downstream communities had been replaced with cheaper alternatives that failed basic safety standards. The scope of fraud was so extensive that multiple federal agencies were now reviewing the case. Environmental Protection Agency investigators were examining whether wetlands destruction violated federal law. FBI financial crime specialists were analyzing whether the land acquisition constituted mail fraud or wire fraud. Even the Department of Agriculture was interested in whether agricultural preservation programs had been illegally circumvented. Eli found himself at the center of a legal hurricane that had grown far beyond his original quest for justice. What had begun as a simple property dispute was becoming a landmark case that could reshape how agricultural land was protected from development pressure throughout rural America. The final court filing that would determine the fate of 127 families sat on David Walsh's desk like an unexploded bomb. Its 847 pages representing 3 years of research, investigation, and legal preparation that had consumed his practice and transformed his understanding of property law. The document represented more than litigation strategy. It was a historical record that traced the Zook family's connection to their land back through 5 generations of careful stewardship and legal protection. Walsh had worked 18-hour days for the past month, cross-referencing every deed survey and legal agreement that touched on the Meadowbrook property. His office had become a war room covered with maps, timelines, and family trees that illustrated the complex web of ownership rights. The HOA had attempted to unravel through bureaucratic maneuvering. The filing deadline was tomorrow at 5 p.m., and Walsh knew that any errors or omissions could doom Eli's case regardless of its underlying merit. "I've never prepared a case this thoroughly," Walsh told his paralegal as they conducted final reviews of the supporting documentation. "We have evidence spanning 175 years. Expert witnesses from 6 different fields, and legal precedents from 12 states. If we lose this case, it won't be because we didn't do our homework." But legal preparation was only half the battle. Eli faced sleepless nights weighing the moral implications of what victory would mean for his neighbors. Winning would give him legal ownership of every house in Meadowbrook. Estates of power over other families' lives that seemed to contradict everything his. Amish faith taught about humility and service to others. He spent long hours walking the boundaries of his remaining 5 acres, praying for wisdom to use any victory in ways that honored Sarah's memory and promoted healing rather than revenge. The gold wedding ring on his finger had become a worry stone that he turned constantly while considering the awesome responsibility that legal victory would place on his shoulders. Bishop Samuel Miller visited twice during those final weeks, offering counsel that balanced Amish principles with recognition that sometimes justice required confronting evil rather than simply enduring it. "The Lord calls us to be peacemakers," the bishop reminded Eli, "but peace without justice is just submission to wrongdoing. If you win this fight, the test will be what you do with the victory." The pressure intensified when Patricia Vance launched a final desperate campaign to destroy Eli's credibility before the crucial hearing. Her strategy relied on character assassination, disguised as legal argument, portraying him as a greedy opportunist who manipulated his wife's death to gain sympathy, while pursuing a frivolous lawsuit designed to extort money from innocent homeowners. Her motions to the court painted Eli as an uneducated farmer who didn't understand the property disputes he was pursuing, a religious extremist whose Amish beliefs made him unsuitable for participating in American legal systems, and a publicity seeker who cooperated with media coverage to pressure the court through public opinion rather than legal merit. The plaintiff seeks to exploit outdated documents and public sympathy to overturn legally completed property transfers, Vance argued in her brief. His claims are based on documents predating modern property law and procedures that have been superseded by decades of legislative and judicial development. The court should not allow historical curiosities to undermine the property rights of 127 families who purchased their homes in good faith. But the smear campaign backfired when local media obtained copies of Vance's filings and presented them to readers who'd been following Eli's story for months. Editorial writers who'd initially approached the case as a simple property dispute now characterized it as David versus Goliath, struggle between a grieving widower and corporate interests willing to destroy his reputation to protect their profits. The profits. The Lancaster New Era's lead editorial captured the community's growing outrage. Patricia Vance's attack on Eli Zook's character reveals more about her client's desperation than about his motives. Mr. Zook lost his wife and his family's agricultural heritage to legal maneuvering that occurred while he was focused on end-of-life care. His pursuit of justice through legal channels hardly constitutes the greed and manipulation that Miss Vance alleges. Betty Sheffer's death on a cold December morning added emotional weight and renewed determination to Eli's mission. She'd spent her final weeks helping Walsh's team organize historical documents and providing crucial testimony about property boundary discrepancies that affected her own house as well as many others in the development. Her final conversation with Eli had taken place 3 days before her passing, when she'd insisted on walking through her garden despite the weakness that made every step an effort. "Promise me you won't give up," she'd whispered, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "This isn't just about your land anymore. It's about whether decent people can trust the system to protect them from predators." A funeral filled the Meadowbrook Community Center with residents who'd come to understand that her support for Eli represented more than neighborly kindness. She'd become a symbol of principled opposition to the HOA's authoritarian control over community life. Her eulogy, delivered by Tom Bradley, explicitly connected her memory to the ongoing legal battle that would determine whether Meadowbrook became a community based on mutual respect or continued to operate as a corporate fiefdom. Walsh's masterful preparation of evidence spanning 175 years of land records revealed patterns of legal manipulation that extended far beyond the Zook property. His research had uncovered systematic boundary adjustments, assessment irregularities, and zoning changes that had gradually transferred agricultural land to development interests through a series of seemingly legitimate transactions that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of property protection laws. The evidence presentation would require 3 days of court time, with expert witnesses testifying about historical survey methods, agricultural preservation law, property title procedures, and environmental protection requirements. Each witness had been carefully chosen to demonstrate specific aspects of the HOA's legal vulnerabilities while building toward a comprehensive case that the entire development rested on fraudulent foundations. But Vance had her own experts prepared to challenge every aspect of Walsh's case. Property law professors would testify that historical documents carried no weight under modern legal standards. Development specialists would argue that agricultural preservation requirements had been properly satisfied. Title insurance experts would claim that any irregularities were corrected through subsequent legal procedures. The legal battle would ultimately be decided by Judge Margaret Harrison, a 73-year-old jurist whose 40-year career had made her Lancaster County's most respected authority on property law. Her reputation for fairness was legendary, but so was her impatience with attorneys who wasted her time on frivolous arguments or procedural gamesmanship. Media circus surrounding the Amish David versus corporate Goliath narrative had attracted national attention to what would normally be a routine property dispute. Television crews from Philadelphia and Baltimore had reserved hotel rooms for the duration of the trial. National wire services planned to cover the case as a symbol of broader conflicts between agricultural preservation and suburban development pressure. The publicity created additional pressure on all parties to present their strongest possible cases while avoiding the kind of legal theatrics that could backfire with a judge known for a practical approach to complex disputes. Eli's quiet dignity under media scrutiny had already won public sympathy, but Walsh knew that Judge Harrison would base her decision on legal precedent rather than emotional appeal. Walsh's final preparation session with Eli focused on testimony, strategy, and courtroom procedures that would test his comfort with English legal systems. The questions would be technical and detailed, requiring Eli to demonstrate understanding of property concepts that had never been part of his agricultural education. His answers would need to be precise without sounding rehearsed, confident without appearing arrogant. "Remember that the judge wants to understand what really happened," Walsh counseled. "Tell the truth simply and directly. Don't try to be yourself. Your honesty and integrity are our strongest weapons against their character assassination attempts." The night before the hearing, Eli sat in Sarah's chair beside the kitchen window, reading her final letter by lamplight while snow fell softly on the land that would soon belong to either him or the neighbors who tried to destroy his life. The wedding ring on his finger caught the lamp's glow as he silently promised her that whatever happened in court, he would use any victory to build bridges rather than walls between himself and the community that surrounded him. Judge Margaret Harrison's gavel commanded a courtroom packed beyond capacity with Meadowbrook residents, media representatives, and legal observers who understood they were witnessing a case that could reshape property law throughout rural Pennsylvania. The venerable jurist's weathered hands gripped the symbol of judicial authority with the confidence of someone who'd presided over 4 decades of complex disputes. But her sharp eyes reflected awareness that this particular case carried implications far beyond the usual boundaries of property litigation. "This court will hear arguments in the matter of Zook versus Meadowbrook Homeowners Association and related parties," Judge Harrison announced, her voice carrying the authority that made even the most aggressive attorneys sit straighter in their chairs. "I want to establish ground rules immediately. This case will be decided on legal merit, not media coverage or public sentiment. Counsel will confine their arguments to relevant law and admissible evidence." The standing room only crowd included residents whose entire financial security depended on the outcome, neighbors who'd watched the conflict evolve from property dispute to community civil war, and journalists who recognized that the David versus Goliath narrative had captured national attention to an unprecedented degree. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Walsh rose to present his opening statement. "Your Honor, this case concerns the systematic theft of agricultural land through legal procedures that were deliberately manipulated to circumvent property protections established over more than a century," Walsh began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment. "The evidence will show that Meadowbrook Development Corporation and the Homeowners Association executed a carefully planned fraud that violated federal agricultural preservation laws, state property protections, and basic principles of due process." Walsh's masterful presentation of historical evidence began with Heinrich Zook's original 1847 purchase and traced the family's continuous occupation through 5 generations of careful stewardship. Each document was presented chronologically, creating a narrative that demonstrated unbroken legal ownership and active agricultural use that contradicted every element of the HOA's abandonment claims. The 1923 easement agreement drew particular attention when Walsh demonstrated how Eli's grandfather had protected subsurface rights that were never properly transferred to subsequent owners. The defendant claims they purchased all rights to this property, Walsh argued, but they never acquired rights that were explicitly reserved by the Zook family 60 years before this development was even conceived. Patricia Vance's increasingly weak defense of the HOA's actions became apparent during her cross-examination of Walsh's historical evidence. Her attempts to challenge the authenticity of century-old documents seemed desperate rather than persuasive, particularly when confronted with corroborating evidence from multiple independent sources. Mr. Walsh, are you seriously asking this court to overturn modern property transfers based on documents that predate current legal standards? Vance argued, her voice carrying a note of exasperation that suggested she recognized her position's weaknesses. I'm asking this court to enforce legal agreements that were deliberately ignored by defendants who hoped no one would research the property's actual ownership history. Walsh replied calmly. The key testimony came from Martha Hendricks, whose 37 years as county records clerk had given her intimate knowledge of how property documentation should be maintained. Her quiet professionalism provided devastating testimony about irregularities in the Meadowbrook approval process that violated established procedures for protecting agricultural land. The agricultural preservation requirements were clearly marked. In our files, Hendricks testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone who dedicated her career to maintaining public records with scrupulous accuracy. Any competent title search would have revealed restrictions that required specific approval before development could proceed. Her testimony became even more damaging when she described conversations with development company representatives who'd specifically asked her to minimize documentation that might complicate their approval process. They wanted to expedite everything, she recalled. When I explained that agricultural preservation requirements couldn't be waived without proper procedures, they suggested that those requirements might not apply to their particular project. The dramatic moment arrived when Walsh presented the original 1847 deed, its yellowed paper and faded ink representing the foundation of everything his case had built toward. Judge Harrison examined the document with the careful attention of someone who understood that legal history often hinged on such seemingly fragile evidence. This deed establishes the Zook family's original ownership of the entire area now occupied by Meadowbrook Estates. Walsh explained, every subsequent transfer of rights must be traced back to this foundation, and our research shows that critical ownership elements were never properly conveyed to the defendants. Patricia Vance's objections to the historical evidence seemed increasingly frantic as Judge Harrison's pointed questions revealed the HOA's legal vulnerabilities. Her attempts to argue that modern property law superseded historical agreements faltered when confronted with the judge's detailed knowledge of agricultural preservation statutes and property transfer requirements. Ms. Vance, are you suggesting that property owners can simply ignore easement restrictions and ownership reservations by claiming they're outdated? Judge Harrison asked, her tone suggesting she found such arguments unconvincing. Your Honor, we're arguing that reasonable reliance on county records and title insurance should protect good-faith purchasers from claims based on documents that weren't properly recorded in modern filing systems, Vance replied. But her confidence seemed forced. The testimony phase reached its climax when Eli took the witness stand, his plain black suit and quiet dignity providing stark contrast to the legal circus surrounding him. Walsh's direct examination allowed Eli to tell his story in his own words. The 4 decades of caring for land his great-grandfather had purchased, the devotion to Sarah during her final illness, and the shock of returning from her funeral to find bulldozers destroying his family's heritage. Mr. Zook, in your own words, please tell the court what this land means to your family, Walsh requested. It's not just property, Eli replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd lived his convictions for 6 decades. It's where my great-grandfather built his first cabin, where my grandfather learned farming, where my father raised his children. Every acre has memories. Every field has stories. When they destroyed our barn, they weren't just tearing down wood and stone. They were erasing the work of 4 generations. His testimony about Sarah's final concerns proved particularly powerful. When he read excerpts from her letter that documented the HOA's increasing pressure during her illness. "She knew they were waiting for us to be vulnerable," Eli said simply. "She knew they would strike when we couldn't defend ourselves." Sarah's garden journal, admitted as evidence of continuous occupation and improvement, became the final devastating blow to the HOA's abandonment claims. Page after page of careful records demonstrated active land management that continued right up until Sarah's death, the antithesis of abandonment that the HOA's case required. Judge Harrison's decisive ruling came after less than an hour of deliberation, delivered with the crisp authority of someone who'd found the legal questions far clearer than the opposing attorneys had suggested. Her voice carried across the packed courtroom like a bell tolling the end of a long and bitter conflict. After careful review of the evidence presented, this court finds that the defendant's acquisition of the Zook family property violated multiple state and federal regulations governing agricultural preservation and property transfer procedures, Judge Harrison announced. The agricultural preservation status established in 1976 required specific approval that was never obtained. The abandonment proceedings were conducted while the plaintiff was providing end-of-life care for his spouse, constituting a violation of due process protections for vulnerable property owners. The immediate legal transfer of all 127 property deeds to Eli Zook sent shockwaves through the courtroom that registered like a physical force. Meadowbrook residents who dismissed his lawsuit as a desperate gesture from a bitter old man suddenly faced the reality that their homes belonged to the quiet Amish farmer they'd allowed their HOA to torment for 3 years. Patricia Vance's stunned silence spoke louder than any of her previous legal arguments. Her confident predictions of easy victory had been replaced by the professional humiliation of losing a case she'd characterized as frivolous. The HOA board members sat in their front row seats looking like survivors of a natural disaster, unable to process the magnitude of their defeat. Rick Coleman's face had gone ashen as he calculated the financial implications of the judgment. His personal investment in the development company meant that he faced not only the loss of his Meadowbrook home but potential bankruptcy from the cascading lawsuits that would inevitably follow. The man who'd orchestrated the land grab while Eli buried his wife now found himself facing the loss of everything he'd spent decades accumulating. Janet Morrison's reaction was perhaps the most telling. The woman who dismissed Eli as a backward farmer incapable of understanding modern property law now sat frozen in disbelief as the implications of his victory became clear. Her authority as HOA president had evaporated in the space of Judge Harrison's 15-minute ruling, replaced by the humiliating reality that she would need to negotiate with the man she'd tried to destroy. The media frenzy that erupted outside the courthouse captured the David versus Goliath narrative that had made Eli's story national news. Television reporters who'd followed the case for months now had the dramatic conclusion. They'd been hoping for complete vindication for the elderly Amish farmer who challenged an entire suburban development and won. This is an unprecedented ruling that could reshape property law throughout rural America, one legal commentator told the cameras. Judge Harrison has essentially held that agricultural preservation laws create property rights that can't be circumvented through bureaucratic maneuvering, regardless of how technically correct the procedures might appear. But the immediate questions facing Eli were practical rather than legal. What does a 65-year-old Amish farmer do with 127 suburban homes and the awesome responsibility of being landlord to people who'd spent 3 years trying to destroy his life? The wedding ring on his finger seemed heavier as he contemplated the moral implications of his complete victory. David Walsh's guidance focused on the immediate legal responsibilities that came with property ownership. You now own every house in Meadowbrook Estates, Walsh explained during their post-victory meeting. That means you're responsible for property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and compliance with all applicable housing codes. You're also entitled to collect rent from every resident, set occupancy terms, and make decisions about property improvements. The scope of I's new responsibilities was staggering. He owned property worth more than $50 million, but he also owned the mortgages, maintenance headaches, and community dynamics of an entire suburban development. The simple life he'd shared with Sarah had been replaced by complex legal and financial obligations that would have challenged an experienced property manager. More importantly, he held the power to determine the future of 127 families who'd become unwilling participants in a property dispute they'd never understood. He could evict residents who'd supported the HOA's harassment campaign. He could raise rents to market levels that would force out families with modest incomes. He could demolish houses and return the land to agricultural use, destroying millions of dollars in suburban investment. The temptation for revenge was real, particularly when he remembered the code violations, bureaucratic harassment, and personal attacks that had made the past 3 years a nightmare of legal battles and community hostility. Sarah's memory provided both motivation for justice and guidance toward mercy as he considered how to use his unprecedented victory. His quiet acceptance, a victory without celebration or gloating, reflected the Amish values that had sustained him through the long legal battle. Judge Harrison's ruling had vindicated his claims and exposed the HOA's corruption, but celebration seemed inappropriate when so many of his neighbors faced uncertainty about their housing security and financial futures. The immediate focus shifted from legal victory to practical questions about community, healing, and property management that would test Eli's wisdom far more than the courtroom battle had tested his resolve. The community agreement that Eli drafted in his careful handwriting represented everything Sarah's memory had taught him about choosing restoration over revenge. The document he presented at the packed Meadowbrook Community Center meeting offered terms so generous that even his harshest critics found themselves speechless with surprise and grudging respect. "I want to read you something my Sarah wrote before she died," Eli began, standing before an audience that included families who'd supported the HOA's campaign against him, and neighbors who'd risked community ostracism to defend his rights. She said the land remembers everyone who's loved it, and she asked me to make sure it remembered that I fought for healing, not hatred. His announcement of intentions for the properties reflected months of careful consideration guided by Amish principles of forgiveness and community restoration. Rather than exercising his legal right to evict residents or demand market-rate rents, Eli offered to sell each home back to its current occupants at the original purchase price, not the inflated market values that had made Meadowbrook one of Lancaster County's most expensive developments. "You bought these houses in good faith," he continued, his voice carrying the calm authority that had sustained him through 3 years of legal warfare. "You shouldn't suffer because the people you trusted to handle the purchase lied to you about how they acquired the land. If you want to stay, you can buy your house from me for exactly what you paid the development company." The offer meant that families would save tens of thousands of dollars compared to current market values, while Eli would recoup the legal costs and property expenses that victory had imposed on him. More importantly, it created a foundation for community healing based on mutual respect rather than the fear and resentment that had poisoned Meadowbrook's social dynamics. The establishment of the Sarah Zook Memorial Foundation for Agricultural Preservation provided a permanent legacy that would protect other farming families from the kind of predatory development practices that had nearly destroyed the Zook heritage. Funded by Eli's settlement with Commonwealth title insurance, The foundation would provide legal assistance to farmers facing development pressure and maintain a preservation fund for purchasing agricultural easements. Sarah worried that other families would face what we faced, Eli explained. This foundation will make sure they have help when developers come calling with legal tricks and bureaucratic schemes. The conversion of Meadowbrook's central common areas back to community gardens represented perhaps the most symbolic element of Eli's restoration plan. Where the HOA had maintained sterile lawns that served no purpose beyond appearance, Eli proposed vegetable plots where residents could grow food and children could learn where meals actually originate. The soil is still good under all that grass, he told the gathering. With proper care, it can feed families again instead of just looking pretty. The former HOA board members' varied reactions to Eli's mercy reflected their different levels of involvement in the original land grab conspiracy. Janet Morrison's grudging apology came with her resignation from any future community leadership role, a recognition that her credibility had been permanently destroyed by her role in the fraudulent acquisition scheme. I believed we were following proper procedures, she said, though her words carried little conviction. I regret that our actions caused Mr. Zook such pain during his time of grief. Rick Coleman's response was more complex, colored by his dual role as HOA treasurer and development company investor. His financial exposure from the legal judgment meant that he faced personal bankruptcy regardless of Eli's generous settlement terms. His eventual departure from Meadowbrook represented a tacit admission that his presence would continue to poison community relations. Tom Bradley's emergence as a new community leader reflected the grassroots organizing that had supported Eli throughout the legal battle. His engineering background and reputation for fairness made him a natural choice to coordinate the property transfer process and establish new governance structures based on cooperation rather than authoritarian control. The new community dynamics that emerged were built on the foundation of mutual respect that Eli's victory and subsequent mercy had created. Residents who'd once feared HOA fines for minor violations now worked together on community gardens and neighborhood improvement projects. The atmosphere of suspicion and regulatory harassment was replaced by the kind of collaborative spirit that turned suburban developments into actual communities. Eli's decision to build a small cottage on the original farmland site, rather than the sprawling house his wealth could now afford, reflected his commitment to the simple lifestyle that had sustained him through decades of agricultural work and recent years of legal warfare. The modest structure sat where his great-grandfather's first cabin had stood, creating a tangible connection between past and future that honored family heritage while embracing community integration. The integration of Amish values with suburban community needs created a unique social experiment that attracted attention from sociologists and community planners interested in alternatives to traditional HOA governance structures. Meadowbrook's transformation from an authoritarian development into a cooperative community became a model for developments throughout rural Pennsylvania. 1 year later, the thriving community garden and healed relationships provided evidence that Eli's choice of restoration over revenge had created something more valuable than legal victory. Former enemies worked side by side in vegetable plots where children learned about plant growth and seasonal cycles. Evening conversations on front porches replaced the isolation of families hiding behind electronic entertainment. Eli found peace in Sarah's memory while building new friendships with neighbors who'd learned to appreciate the wisdom of someone who measured success in terms of community health rather than property values. His morning walks through the garden paths where cornrows had once run straight and true revealed a landscape that honored both agricultural heritage and suburban reality. The final scene mirrored the opening in ways that demonstrated how completely the conflict had transformed everyone involved. Where Eli had once stood alone beside Sarah's grave, wrestling with anger and grief over his family's stolen heritage. He now worked the reclaimed community gardens surrounded by neighbors who'd chosen cooperation over conflict, restoration over resentment. His quiet satisfaction came not from the legal victory that had vindicated his claims or the financial settlement that had secured his future, but from the knowledge that he'd honored Sarah's final request to fight for healing rather than hatred. The wedding ring on his finger caught the morning sunlight as he tended vegetables that would feed families who'd learned the true meaning of home through a conflict that had tested everyone's capacity for forgiveness and grace. The land remembered everyone who'd loved it, just as Sarah had promised, and now it would remember Eli as the man who chose to build bridges rather than walls, even when justice would have supported whatever revenge he might have chosen instead.